Rather different in orientation was the other great formative adventure, or counterattack, if you like, of Christendom against Islam, namely the Crusades. And although I don't wish to turn this into a history lecture, no account of the mutual link between Islam and the West and mutual attitudes will be complete without at least mentioning the Crusades. The Crusades are different because whereas the Reconquista begins in a fairly secular key and only later becomes religiously ideologized and justified, the Crusades start out as a religious enterprise and later develop a secular dimension. The idea of fighting for the Christian faith probably goes back at least as far as the Emperor Constantine. It's very emphatically alien to the spirit of the New Testament, but Constantine and to some extent also Augustine were happy to develop Christian theories of a just war, the idea that the Christian could take up arms in defense of the faith. So we find, for instance, in the middle of the Dark Ages, somebody called Agobard, who's from Lyon, writing that the subjugation of barbarous nations so that they may embrace the faith and widen the frontiers of the kingdom of the faithful is to be recommended. Hence we find that the popes increasingly, when they invest the emperors with the symbols of office, give them a sword as well. Another quote from the same period, a certain Brun of Querfort, actually one of the leading monastic reformers of the 10th century, taught that a Christian king's duty was to compel heathens to come in by the sword. And we find a lot of cases of this, for instance, the Teutonic Knights as they pushed the frontiers of Christendom into Poland and the Baltic states, essentially offering people the choice of baptism and the sword. The conversion of the Norwegians, another example of this. They could either convert to Christianity or they would have their hands and their feet cut off. That was how the northern Norwegians became Christians. Again, utterly alien to the spirit of the Gospels, but more or less normative in the early medieval period. And it's this strand of thought that really forms the mental backdrop to the idea of the crusade. For centuries, Christians have been making pilgrimages to Jerusalem, and by and large, it's fair to say that they were not obstructed. Inevitably, there would be bandits and minor petty officials along the way who might harass them in the way that they might harass other people as well. But generally, it was possible for Christians to go. The idea of crusade ultimately was not to open the way for Christian pilgrimage, it was to recapture land that was rightfully Christian. And it took place not in this early period, the 3 first centuries of Christian reaction to Islam, but with the reforming popes of the 11th century. One priority of the popes of this period was to encourage greater central control of the principalities of Europe. And this, of course, required that they stop fighting against each other. And a good way of doing this, of course, was to set up an external enemy, namely the world of Islam. Get them all together, different nations, different principalities, dynasties, fighting against a common enemy, and you'll pull Europe together much more easily. So the papacy starts to encourage this mood by, for instance, beginning in the 11th century to declare indulgences for those who fought against the Saracens in Spain. So we start to find knights from France, for instance, coming into Spain to take part in the Reconquista. We also find in the same century the Pope giving war banners to expeditions against the Muslims of Sicily and an ill-fated expedition against Tunisia. He would also give similar banners to campaigns against the schismatic Byzantines. So against this very new atmosphere in Christendom, we find in 1095 Pope Urban II making his famous speech at the city of Clermont, urging the assembled representatives of Christendom to launch a war against the Muslims of the East. And thus is born an event which is certainly the single most formative event, not so much in the history of the Middle East, because the Crusades really, in the longer term, left no noticeable consequences on the map, but in terms of the mutual perception of Christians and Muslims. The old, not so much a symbiotic relationship, but an ability to accommodate and deal with the other that had prevailed before the Crusades was now to be swept away. So the First Crusade fights its way to Palestine in 1099 and captures Jerusalem. And the fall of Jerusalem is an event of absolute horror. It's said that about 90,000 people, all of the non-Christian population, was immediately put to the sword. And this has left lasting scars in the region. So even today, the word Salibi or Crusader is a very pejorative term in the Arabic language. And when people making mosque sermons, for instance, or political leaders in the Islamic world want to denounce Western interference in the world of Islam, they will refer to them as Crusaders. In the Western languages, of course, the word Crusader has fairly neutral or even positive connotations. You can have a crusade against crime or something like that, and it's regarded as a legitimate phrase to use. So this massacre is very horrible, and it has considerable ramifications for the regional mindset. So if I find a friar who was present at the massacre speaking of horses moving knee-deep in Saracen blood, and he declared enthusiastically, "It is a wonderful judgment of God." And even St. Bernard gave his support and writing, "A Christian glories in the death of a Saracen because Christ is glorified thereby." And the Crusaders go on to create little replicas of the European feudal societies they've left behind. Generally, they're contemptuous of Muslim beliefs and religious practices, but as I indicated earlier, they came to be not averse to taking on some of the more secular, civilized, almost luxurious trappings of Middle Eastern life. So the Frankish enclave in Palestine becomes one channel for the movement of certain aspects of Islamic civilization into Europe, far less significant, though, than, say, the movement of translation or the Reconquista of Spain. The success of the Crusades was famously the result not so much of the strength of the Christian armies. The subsequent Crusades were generally complete catastrophes, but were made possible by Muslim disunity and the lack of a comparable religious militancy on the Muslim side. There was no Muslim ethos of counter-crusade for some time until the great Kurdish general Saladin united Syria and Egypt under his rule and retook Jerusalem in 1187. It's important to recall that Saladin, when he entered the city, did not order an equivalent massacre. City's churches were left intact. And in fact, those who had survived from the non-Catholic churches there made it quite plain that they actually preferred Muslim rule to that of the rather less tolerant Latins. Comparable to the statement of Gennadios, the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, when the city was in the process of falling, and they were offered support from Latin Christians. Their experience of Latin Christian intolerance had been so acute that he said famously, "Better the turban of the Turk than the mitre of Rome." And it was similar for the Eastern Christians, who were able to live in peace, not interfered with as they had been previously. Waves of further crusaders still turn up from Europe. Generally, they're beaten off without much difficulty. And Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands as an inseparable part of the spiritual metabolism of the Muslim world until, of course, the creation of Israel takes place in 1948 to initiate a further and no less unnecessary episode of West-East incomprehension. One effect of the Crusades in Europe was to bring home to Europeans the continued strength of Islam. Subsequent Crusades operated on a different and more cautious strategy, recognizing that Palestine could only be held for Christendom if one adopted a more sober, larger policy towards the region as a whole. And so we find Crusaders aiming to subjugate not just Palestine, but surrounding countries. St. Louis's expedition to Egypt in 1249 is a good example of this. Another complete catastrophe in which these incredibly heavily armoured French knights more or less submerge in the marshes of the Nile Delta. They're completely annihilated. Crusades continue to be launched, though. They haven't learnt their lesson. St. Louis attacks Tunisia in 1270. In 1313, a Dominican called Guillaume Adam, who travelled a bit in the Muslim world, wrote a kind of manual of crusading by the name of De Modo Saracenos Extirpandi, on the way to exterminate Saracens, which laid even more ambitious plans for the invasion of Egypt in order to construct a Christian fleet in the Red Sea, which would sack Mecca and Medina and go on to attack the Muslim world from behind. And the justification for this in the theology by this time was quite simple. One didn't need any provocation to attack Muslims because they were, by their very existence on the earth, a provocation and a flagrant blasphemy against God. They were summa culpabilis. They were the sum of everything that is blameworthy, and hence it's the Christian knight's religious duty to try and extirpate them. As I said, the Crusades left very little impact on the map of the Near East, but they did have an effect on the shaping of Muslim attitudes towards these strange people who lay beyond the ocean. But their consequences for European history were far more considerable. You recall that I mentioned the Pirenne thesis earlier, that the conquests of the early Muslims started to make Christians think of Europe as some kind of coherent entity, something which had never been before in history. And the Crusades very much strengthened this image. And increasingly, the other, the demonic other, was identified with Islam and the world of Islam. So following the Crusades, we find a new type of European mentality emerging, one that is self-conscious and ideologically militant in its hostility to Muslims. Not just opportunistic border skirmishing, one monarch taking the land off another monarch who happens to be Muslim or whatever, but an ideologized split now emerging between Christendom and the world of Islam. And this idea of crusade also carried over into other larger campaigns. It's worth remembering that the Portuguese navigators saw themselves as crusaders and meted out to the various peoples, including non-Muslims, that they encountered the same kind of treatment that the Muslims had experienced in Palestine. Vasco da Gama and others generally would wear crusading outfits. They would take the Crusader cross and so forth. So this becomes really the defining event in the formation of the European mind. Historian Stephen Runciman says, "Through the Crusades, Europe found its soul." This perception continues even today. Only 3 years ago, the President of the European Union, Jacques Delors, made a speech in which he said that membership of the European Union is conditional on possessing a shared Christian heritage. And this is very clearly indicative of a mentality that has gone on for 800 years. Europeanness means Christianness, and the other, the barbarian, is what lies beyond. Many other things could be said about subsequent attitudes on both sides. One could talk, for instance, about the strange movement of self-inflicted martyrdom. So important was the conflict with Islam's scene that a number of Christians actually deliberately went to the Muslim world and courted martyrdom. The first instances of this happen in the 9th century, when we find a few monks and nuns deliberately going before Muslims and insulting the Prophet in the hope that they will be martyred. And this continues, so we find one of the greatest medieval Christian thinkers, Ramon Lull, who's a Catalan, who really devotes his life to refuting Islam in a philosophical way. Very bright man. He travels 3 times to what is now Algeria and goes to the Friday prayers and stands outside and shouts these words of abuse against the Prophet. And 3 times he's deported. The Muslims think this is some kind of nutcase, and they put him on the next ship back to Spain. The 4th time he goes to Tunis and he does the same thing and is actually killed by a mob. It seems incomprehensible to the modern mind, but this was actually quite common. And St. Francis of Assisi even did the same thing. He went to Egypt, appeared before the Sultan al-Adil. Sultan said, "Well, why have you come?" And he starts to vomit up these insults about the Quran and the Prophet. And he's also sent home. Indicative again of this incomprehension, I mentioned last time the 4 great reasons that Europeans had for rejecting Islam. Firstly, it's a falsehood and a perversion of the truth. It's a religion of violence and the sword. Particularly strange thing for people who are gearing themselves up for crusades to believe, but that was what they said. Thirdly, it's a religion of self-indulgence. Fourthly and finally, Muhammad is the Antichrist. I think probably that's a good place, if a rather depressing one, to stop the narrative. I did mention last time that the situation has changed utterly, not least because of the changes that have been going on in theological circles. No longer do mainstream Christians believe that the Prophet was the Antichrist. In fact, the most recent serious biography of the Prophet by Karen Armstrong, who's a well-known ex-Catholic nun, is actually so sympathetic to the Prophet that a Muslim organisation in England gave her a prize for it. Muslims actually like the book very much. So those old medieval attitudes have largely been superseded. They are, however, as such stereotypes and prejudices tend to do, lurking beneath the surface. And it's always possible to find small-minded evangelical groups, particularly in some of the southern states of the United States, resurrecting these old images. So just 2 months ago, tens of thousands of houses in the largely Muslim city of Bradford in England had a 64-page booklet abusing the Prophet pushed through their letterboxes, with information on how to contact something called Chick Publications in California in order to get more information. And there's a little form at the bottom, I've actually seen these things, saying, do you accept Jesus Christ as your personal saviour? Tick the little box. And then there's something like, thank you, God, for showing me what you think of Islam, etc., etc. And it's a pretty horrifying thing. And Muslims in England do recognise that this is something that is horrific and rejected by the mainstream churches. I mention it simply to remind us that this, in many ways, quite miserable epic of mutual incomprehension is still continuing, that there are still classical stereotypes of Islam as a religion of violence, the sword, martyrdom, etc., which are trotted out by journalists. And the enthusiasm with which journalists and other cheap cultural commentators will attribute Muslim political violence to Muslimness rather than to the objective causes of their violence. The idea being that somehow, even if Palestine hadn't been occupied by the Israelis, Hamas would still be in existence, there would still be terrorist bombs, etc. This is a very dangerous thing. The worst error one can make in contemplating somebody else's religious world and civilization is to judge the mainstream on the basis of the antics of the lunatic fringe. Unfortunately, this is all too common amongst our journalists in the West, and the consequences for it are potentially quite frightening. And I think it's fair to remark that the incomprehension is mutual, that there is a Muslim stereotype also of the Christian world and of the West, generated in large part not just by the memory of things like the Crusades, but also more recently by the journalistic propensity to focus on extreme, unpleasant, frightening manifestations which are newsworthy and ignoring the mainstream. So that, for instance, when the Waco siege was covered in the Arabic press, somehow people got the impression that this was some kind of typical mainstream messianic Christian event. The Moonies are also regarded as a very important Christian phenomenon. The bloodthirsty declarations of the Serbian bishops are taken as being normative rather than marginal. So it's a process of mutual incomprehension. And since this is my last lecture, perhaps I could close on the note that encounters such as this, while they might seem to be important and insignificant, actually can play a very fundamental and much needed role in overcoming this incomprehension, which is certainly one of the most frightening and urgent needs as we approach the new millennium. And my experience of you all has been that you are very open-minded, decent and concerned people. And it's my confidence that we will all work as hard as we can to overcome these prejudices, which have caused such misery and gratuitous warfare and suffering in the past, and which we must now definitively set behind us. A few minutes for questions, and then that's that.